This isn't a very enviable position to be in, having to follow a presentation like that, so I hope I can keep your attention. I don't have any dancing figures, but I have a few slides. I was asked to talk about the role of research evidence in scaling up and replicating family planning programs in the perspective of the follow-on from the London conference and the summit that was held there and has now evolved into what is known as FP 2020 and a continuation of ICPD, as we've been talking about this morning, and we still realize that we still have as a major goal the MDG 5B out there. So my question is, do we need evidence for scaling up and replication, and what do we mean by scaling up and replication? And these terms, I think, were chosen for this presentation because when we look at the London conference, it was all about scale, 120 million new users to reduce unmet need, with the implication that we have to scale up, we have to replicate, we have to do much, much more to be able to achieve this goal by 2020. But when you look at what is it more that we need to bear in mind that there are going to be more resources. We heard from Mr. Chairman that there's going to be many more billions apparently available. But with that comes more expectations. This money doesn't come for free in that sense. There's an expectation that we will generate 120 million new users. There's an expectation that we'll need more services to be able to provide these, to meet the needs of these 120 million women. And with that comes both more justification to be able to justify why we're doing what we're doing and why we're able to reach that number. And to be able to answer that, we'll need more evidence around what works, what doesn't work. So for me, more than ever at this point in time, we need good, solid evidence to guide the way forward. But what type of evidence will we need? A lot of what we heard about in the London summit was, well, we need evidence on what works. But when we talk about what works, things work in different ways, and the way you judge whether they work or not depends on what it is you're trying to do. So are you trying to reduce unintended pregnancies? Or are you trying to reduce unmet need for family planning, which is the guiding goal of the conference, of the movement? Are you trying to increase access to family planning services? Are you trying to increase demand for services? Are we trying to ensure there's greater equity in access and use? Are we trying to enable people to fulfill their rights to be able to access and to have the children that they want to have? So there are a lot of ways of looking at what works, and the type of evidence that you need for that will depend on which of those questions is of priority concern to the countries involved. But for that, we also have to answer the question of what does it cost? And for this, we do need to know what does it cost to the woman, to the couple, to be able to access and use family planning services, and what does it cost to the government to provide services where the government is a major provider of services. But then we have to put the two together. We have to ask ourselves, well, what is the most cost-effective option? Because you can have a highly effective option, but it costs way more than you have available, even with the additional funds. What options are we able to consider? When we do any sort of cost-effectiveness analysis, you have to bear up and look at different options. And quite often those considerations will be determined by which populations are we trying to reach, who has the unmet need, who are these 120 million people in need of family planning, and through which sectors are we going to be able to do that. And this is an issue which is of diverse importance in this room. Some countries in this room still have a primarily public sector system for delivering family planning services. Others have a system highly dependent on the private and commercial sectors. Other countries have a mix in between. So cost effectiveness depends on which sectors are delivering the services. But when we think about, okay, between now and 2020, I see three big considerations we need to take into account when thinking about what evidence do we need and how do we generate it. The first is, do we need more of the same? Are we doing things pretty well? We just need to do them at a bigger scale. Are things working well? I mean, we hear in Bangladesh, yes, it looks like things are working very well here. Maybe we just do more of the same. But in other places, do we need something more innovative? Do we need to look a little differently at the situation? Do we need something to change to be able to achieve those goals? And tied in with that, we can't forget the audience here. Who uses the research evidence and how do they do that? So if we're looking at that first big issue, scaling up and replicating what is already working fairly well, the types of evidence that we'll need to be able to guide how to go forward from that, I've put up some suggestions here about the sort of things that we need to look at. How can we do more with the same resources for those countries where there aren't particularly large commitments, either from the government or from donors? How can they do more with the same resources? That's the type of evidence that's going to be needed. For those that are going to be getting additional resources, either from their own governments or from donors or other sources, how can they effectively absorb these additional resources? What can be done to better function with the additional resources? And that is often harder than it sounds. Everyone likes to have more money, more in the pocket, but then how do you absorb? How do you use it? And then the other considerations around programs that are apparently functioning pretty well, in terms of the quality of the services. They may be performing well in terms of the effectiveness, but what quality of service are they offering? Are they ensuring that the client's perspectives are really there and are really being adhered to? And is there equity and access across the population as a whole? So where might the evidence for addressing these issues come from? The title of the talk was Research-Based Evidence. Well, that's one source of evidence, but for me, I think if we're in this type of situation, we need to look a lot more and invest a lot more in strengthening the management information systems that are running that existing program, in the national health accounts that are telling us how the funding is being spent. We need to invest in greater feedback from management and supervisory processes to understand how is this good program functioning? What is the management telling us? How the supervisory process is working? We need evidence from case studies and learning by doing. And obviously we still need some limited research in there. By research, I'm talking here about research into the costs, the quality, equity and accountability. Because these are areas where, even in a well-performing program, there are always areas for improvement in understanding around these issues and how they function. But the other thing that we heard a lot about in London was it's not business as usual. It cannot be business as usual. We need to stimulate, we need to sustain change to be able to generate the services that will address the unmet needs of these 120 million. So in that case, I think we do need to look to research to generate evidence to help guide the way that programs and policies can move forward. We need to know what are the effective approaches that can increase access and use. And as has been the common theme throughout this morning and the previous presentation by Professor Rosling, the answers are in the room. The successes are in the room, and these are where the evidence is going to come from about what works and what doesn't work in terms of improving access and use. Offering choice and making sure that the choices that are offered are acceptable. Again, the answers are in the room. The answers can come from each other. And what about making sure that these services are affordable to the client and sustainable to the program? These are terms that are often mixed together, but in actual fact, they mean very different things. What is affordable to a client may not be sustainable to a program, and vice versa. And so these issues need to be considered, and we need more evidence around these issues to be able to guide programs that are looking to change in the way forward. And the evidence for to answer these types of questions does need to come from research, from operations and implementation research in particular. And some of this research is available through systematic reviews, which are a very popular method at the moment of putting together the evidence that comes from randomized controlled trials, from other controlled experiments, and can provide you with evidence around what works in a particular situation. But for that to be useful, we do need to make sure that there are exchanges around that evidence. What works in Bangladesh may or may not work in another country, in another region, in another setting. And so whether that evidence is transferable, whether it can be used in another place, we need to find out by exchanging. And so we do also need to invest in further and continued rigorous controlled studies to understand better what works in a particular situation. And we need to clearly document how these studies are implemented and how they function. Now, the problem with advocating more small-scale experimental studies that really show you what does and doesn't work in scientific terms is that you end up with a lot of pilot projects. And I'm sure many of you in the room, probably everyone I would imagine, has experience about the pitfalls of investing in pilot projects that you put a lot of money into, you put a lot of energy into, you do very top-rate research, but it goes nowhere. And so clearly we need to look at the way that we do research very differently if we'll be able to invest in research over the next few years that is going to guide the investments that are going to come from the London Summit and beyond. And when we ask ourselves why are so few pilot projects scaled up or replicated, the answers are fairly obvious, but we still keep doing them. One of them is that funding is a period of time for the study, that donors, be it the Ministry of Finance or Health or an external donor, only like to invest in the duration of the research study itself. They tend not to think beyond that. And linked in with that, there's no requirement, there's no expectation that those doing the research have any real responsibility to make sure the results are then used and that they can be scaled up or replicated elsewhere. That's not part of the deal. When you sign off on the bottom line to get your grant for a research project, you're not signing up for 10 years to make sure the research is used. You're signing up for the 18 months, 2 years to do the research. And I'm a researcher, I sign these forms quite often, so I know what the bottom line says. Because there's always the expectation that someone else will use your research. The program managers, the policy makers, the decision makers. It's not your responsibility as a researcher to use the findings. But at the same time, there are no conditions in place in the larger programs, in the programs that are already up and running, that are looking to gain evidence, to use the evidence, to be able to absorb and take on board the small-scale results that are coming through from the innovative projects that are demonstrating new ways of working. So we do need to change this current paradigm of undertaking research, funding research, and planning research. And there's various ways we can do that, but I'd like to highlight 3 ways in particular that we should think about over the next 2 years particularly, as we move into this rapid period of investment in the post-London Summit. The first is scale. If you're going to be pilot testing an innovation that is going to be used at a national level, then you have to anticipate that from the beginning. Don't think about those 10,000 people that you're doing the study with. You've got to think about the 10 million people that are going to benefit from the findings of that study, or the 100 million people. The study has to be done with scale in mind. Secondly, most small-scale research studies tend to ignore completely the sustainability of the interventions that are being developed or tested, and there's no real concern about either documenting what it costs to do, what the resource implications are, what the implications are for the health system building blocks that are being affected. But this has to be built into the research itself. You have to be doing the research with an understanding of what are the implications for the health system and for the sustainability of the intervention. And most importantly, we have to think of these small-scale studies as being a means to an end, not an end in themselves. They've got to be the first stage in a process that goes beyond just the study itself. And I'd like to propose that we don't think about moving straight from learning about effectiveness from a research project to expanding and scaling up straight away. We consider an intermediate stage, a stage of learning about efficiency. What does it take to do that same activity, that same intervention that you show can work in a district level or a few villages or a township? To try to take that to scale at the national level immediately would be impossible. You cannot replicate what happened at that level at the national level or even at the provincial level. So there is a need to do an intermediate step of learning to be efficient at what I've put here as the lowest administrative level. So if you've been working at the sub-district level or the village level, then your next stage of implementation has to be at the district level, if that's where your administrative unit lies. And then from there you can learn how to scale up and replicate from the district level to multiple district levels. But you have to take that intermediate step first. And then finally, we have to bear in mind that that's the researcher's perspective as I'm talking here. This is what does it take, how does research fit into the process? What stages do we have to go through? But at the end of the day, we have to bear in mind that research-based evidence is only one influence on the decisions made around policies and program design. And most of you in the room are those people responsible for the circular box there, designing the policies and programs. And as you know yourselves, evidence is only one part of it. You get other influences. You've got your previous experiences. You've got international norms around providing family planning and other services. You have to listen to the opinion of your colleagues and of your electorate if you're a politician. And you have to also, or you should be listening also to the theory. And we've seen some of that from the previous presentation about what is happening and what could be happening if theory applies. So when looking at research-based evidence, we need to put it in perspective. It's only one part of the puzzle of how to improve as we go forward. So in summary, what I'd like to suggest is that we consider that to be able to effectively absorb the additional resources that are going to be coming over the next few years as a result of the London Summit, it will require rigorous evidence, and that evidence needs to be effectively communicated. Now, it takes someone special to do the presentation you saw previously, but we have to think differently in the way that we communicate the results from the research to be able to make it effectively heard and understood and used for decision making. We have to bear in mind that evidence for scaling up, for taking things to a bigger level, is different than the evidence that we use for determining best practices. What is the best way of doing option X and option Y? It's a different way of doing research, a different type of evidence is generated. It's a different process. And for those investing in research, we need to bear that in mind as well. We also need to bear in mind that research-based evidence is not cheap. So we have to be selective in commissioning research and strategically implement that research. So it's not just a standalone research project, it's seen as part of a staged process over time that eventually will lead to changes at the national level. And we have to plan and budget for that research uptake process. It won't just happen accidentally. It has to be strategically planned over a period of time. And as a lead into the next three presenters, country engagement has to include generating research evidence that can be used in this way. If not, if it's purely a commitment to funding family planning in the abstract, then we're going to be losing all sorts of benefits of exchanging of experiences in the room, of generating new evidence to help us to take that springboard for the innovations that may be needed in certain situations. So with that, I'd like to end my speech.
Thank you.